So thank you all for being here again today, this morning. Welcome back. This is the third special education talk series with me, and this is the last one. So we will be wrapping up our activities, getting towards the end of winter break. So welcome back, everyone. And for those who haven't seen me before, my name is Tara, and I am here with Taylor at We are part of the Fulbright Copies program, and we'll be assisting with some English language classes here at So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Can everyone see the screen okay? All right, great. So as I said, this is our third special education series talk. And today what I'll be talking about is really focusing on social and emotional and behavioral needs. The last session, for those who were here, focused more on cognitive disorders that affect education. So today we're going to be focusing more on behavioral and emotional issues in the school setting. I want to talk a little bit about how that affects students and what we can do as educators to assist those types of students. And I'll go over a few case examples that I have from my own experience working with students. For those of you who weren't at the other talks, my background is in social work. So I was working as a special education social worker in Detroit Public Schools. And I was working with students who had behavioral and emotional needs in the school setting, doing some individualized classes, some individualized support services for those students. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the students I worked with and what were some of the things that worked and didn't work for those students. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear from there.
Thanks. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what types of behavioral and emotional difficulties we might encounter in education. And of course, some of these you guys have already heard of. A lot of them are really common in society as a whole, right? So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, kind of define some of these things. So different types of disorders. Most people are already familiar with depression, right? This can lead to a lot of difficulties in school, such as trouble concentrating, falling asleep in class. We know this disrupts sleep patterns. And also a really big thing to be cautious of is when students are, self-harming or thinking of suicide. This is something really important to be on the lookout for. We also have anxiety disorders that affect students of all ages. And specifically under that category, we have social anxiety. So those are the students that have a lot of trouble in social situations with making friends. It's something that produces a lot of stress for them. I also want to focus today on selective mutism disorder. What this means is it refers to a student who in some situations finds themselves unable to communicate verbally. So it's not someone who doesn't know how to speak at all. It's just someone who, because of usually anxiety, is unable to speak in certain situations. And usually this happens most often in social situations. So they might be able to answer questions related to academics, but they might not be able to talk to other kids in the class or talk to the teacher. Those are just some examples. And there's also some description here at the bottom of what that might look like. A lot of times these are the kids who don't show a lot of expression, right? Because they're really kind of trying to hide, so they don't express themselves even through facial expression in some situations. And I'll go a little bit more into that later. This is something that I have a little bit of experience working with some students that had this type of difficulty. We also have, and for those who were at the talk last week, I talked already about other health impairment. So this is a category that really includes anyone who has some type of, sorry, there's some noise here on the street. This is a category who includes anyone that has some type of medical condition that affects them in the classroom. And along with this, we also have a broader category called emotional impairment, which also includes different types of difficulties that affect the students emotionally. and it also impacts their ability to learn. So these are the students who have a lot of trouble making friends. They act out a lot in school. Often they come into school already in a bad mood every day. Those types of more intense emotional responses in the educational setting. So under these categories, we have a lot of different types of disorders, many that you have probably heard of before. So for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. We also have one called reactive attachment disorder. This is typically seen in usually children who have had some kind of trauma and have trouble forming what we call attachments, meaning bonds with a caregiver or bonds with a supportive adult. They have a lot of difficulty developing those relationships because of early trauma in their younger years. The two I want to focus on specifically today under these broad categories of emotional impairment and other health impairment are post-traumatic stress disorder, which is extremely common, not only in children, but also in adults, right? This is when someone experiences a traumatic event and it leaves some kind of long-standing difficulties for them. So there are a lot of people who deal with this. I'm sure at UM we have students who have difficulties with PTSD. And then we have oppositional defiant disorder. This is one more commonly seen also like reactive attachment disorder in younger children. And these are the children who basically act out every day. They have a lot of trouble with behavior. When we think about oppositional defiance, what that means is someone who has trouble with authority figures. So they don't respond well to being told what to do. They don't respond well to directions from adults. They typically want to be, as we say, defiant in every situation. So basically they say no to anything that's asked of them. That's kind of a generalization, but that's what this looks like. So we call that ODD. Are there any questions so far? No? Everything is good? Okay, so let's talk about how this affects students. And again, these are things that students of all ages can have difficulties with. And a lot of you probably know someone who has depression or who has anxiety. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just want to look a little bit about what this looks like. So for most of you who are familiar with depression, we know this can be someone who isn't interested in doing things. Maybe they sleep in past class, they miss class, or they fall asleep during class. They might have some stressed behaviors. So we have, for example, here hand wringing or pacing back and forth. Also, we see a lot of feelings of guilt, feelings of worthlessness. They might express feelings of wanting to die. As I mentioned, this can be related to suicide. And sometimes there's difficulty with concentrating in class as well. A lot of similarities here between depression and anxiety. So similarly, students might have trouble completing classwork because either it's too stressful for them, so they might avoid it. Or on the other hand, you may see a student who is very high performing, but they put a lot of pressure on themselves to really be that high performing all the time. So they tend to get burned out. You might see a student who's self-conscious. Also, anxiety is characterized by a lot of physical symptoms. So sweaty hands, someone might complain of having a stomach ache or a headache. We also have panic attacks under this category, which is, when a student has trouble breathing or they feel like they're having trouble breathing, right? And specifically related to selective mutism, as I mentioned, these students generally have very severe anxiety, so it can cause a lot of physical symptoms for them as well. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder, as I mentioned, this is related to trauma. So it's when someone has experienced a traumatic event. So there may be some avoidance of situations, places, even smells or tastes that remind them of the trauma. We might have a student who's more irritable than normal, so they might just snap for no reason, right? And we don't always understand what's going on with them. We also see a lot of detachment, so not caring much about anything. Sometimes these students present with what we call a flat affect. I'll drop that in the chat. This is another word for being expressionless. So it means that they don't show a lot of emotions often. They've kind of detached themselves from showing emotions, right, to protect themselves in a way. We also see trouble with similarly with depression and anxiety, with paying attention, concentrating, and sometimes these students can also get scared very easily as well. Oppositional defiant disorder, as I mentioned, these are the students who usually act out every day. They have a lot of behavioral difficulties. Sometimes we see them in movies, right? The students who pick up chairs and throw them, or yell at the teacher, or curse in class. Usually, not always, of course, but usually these are the types of students that would be in the category of oppositional defiant disorder. They're refusing to do work. Sometimes they're leaving the classroom without permission, not staying in their seat, right? All those types of outbursts that we see are really common under this oppositional defiant disorder. And as I mentioned, this is really characterized by a hostility towards authority figures. So this is a student who does not want an adult to tell them what to do, right? And we see this mostly, as I said, in younger students. Usually students outgrow this, or it intensifies the older they get, right? And it can really impact their life. So typically the older students, either they're in a different life place because of this, or they've already resolved it, right? It's typically something we see in younger students. So let's talk a little bit about how we can assist these students in the educational setting. I'll pause for a second just in case there's any questions or comments. Are we good? Are you guys understanding everything so far? Am I talking really fast, or it's okay?
I think it's okay. No questions so far.
Okay, thanks, Alicia. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about with best practices, I want to talk about social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is beneficial not only to students with emotional and behavioral difficulties, but really every student, right? We know from research that students of all ages, all different types of students need this type of social emotional learning in the classroom. And it's really beneficial to incorporate this into curriculums. So a lot of schools now, I can only speak to the US specifically because I'm not as familiar with the Brazilian system. A lot of schools are incorporating social emotional learning with academic learning. So I have a little video here that talks a little bit about what that looks like. This video refers specifically to multi-tiered approaches. I'll drop that in the chat. And what that means is basing your approach on the student's needs. So it starts with the first tier, which is all students. So all students receive this base level of social emotional learning. And then the tiers go up as the student's needs intensify. So when you get to tier 2, you have a little bit even more support for those students in social emotional learning. And then at tier 3, we have the students who have the most severe behavioral needs, and we focus really intensely on interventions for those students. So I'll play the video. I'm just going to show the first about half or so, just so you guys can have an idea of what this looks like in the classroom. Hopefully the sound will work. Let me turn it up. Can you guys hear it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
If students aren't comfortable with who they are or with their behaviors in school, if they're not succeeding in those kinds of ways, then they're not going to succeed academically.
If a child is not behaving, there's a need not being met. My biggest goal is to make sure they're getting what they need. you ever have to make a decision, do you know what a decision is?
The approach for social emotional learning within the tier system mirrors our approach to learning in the academic system.
Just like for reading and just like for math, you need a solid core for behavior, for expectation, common language.
That's right. The difference between conflict and bullying. Anybody remember what the differences are?
The core instruction for social emotional in elementary, a big part of that is during morning meetings every day. That's the way that the school day starts.
You greet each other. You get to share what's happening in your life.
Share today. Put your thumb on your knee when you know what you want to share.
Our core instruction is Second Step, and that's a program that ranges from lessons about friendship to conflict resolution. And typically that happens once a week during morning meeting, or that could happen during their whole learning community meeting on Wednesday mornings.
Is bullying something that happened one time, or is it repeated?
Repeat
Is there even power or uneven power?
Then, just like academic instruction, some students need a little bit more. Typically, that tier 2 instruction comes from a guidance counselor, usually within a group setting.
I group them by need, not necessarily by grade. We have friendship groups. Some students, they don't know how to initiate a friendship. I have a grief group of children who have lost a loved one. I have a group for self-regulation. So they're giving strategies on what to do with their emotions when their emotions become very strong.
Okay. Do you ever have to make a really hard decision because you're so angry you don't know what to do? Yeah? I'm going to teach you today something that is going to help you relax. Okay, here we go. Gently close your eyes and take deep breaths.
So the strategy was to give them a sense of calmness, go to their happy place, use that self-talk.
Go on the cloud in your mind and feel how soft and comfortable it is.
I find that sometimes pulling them out is not necessarily the answer. Pushing it is something that I started doing more so in the last 3 years. I wanted to transfer some of the skills that we learn in my office to my classroom.
So last one.
Your turn.
If you can get them to do that enough times, they're going to feel that success in the classroom. They're going to feel successful learning.
Good job, guys. You're working hard. Some students need more intensive support, and so then they would usually meet with the guidance counselor.
All right. I'm going to stop the video there. So what you saw in the video was different types of interventions, right? So we saw in the general classroom, the students received information about bullying, right? Which falls into the area of behavior. And then we saw the guidance counselor, who's here in the pink sweater, doing some smaller group interventions, some smaller group classes focused on specifically students who needed extra support with regulating their emotions, for example. So this is very similar to what I was doing in my job as well, dividing these students up into needs. So having social emotional learning as a general curriculum for all students, but also providing specialized classes for those students who need extra support as well. So that's the first kind of best practice suggestion. I have a lot of different things here. I won't go over all of them. There's a lot you can do to support students with emotional and behavioral needs. I think one of the really important things is building trust and relationships. So making sure that the students trust you, that they can talk to you. I think that's important really in any classroom, right? Having a good relationship with your students as a teacher, as an educator, as a support staff is really, really important. Also, working with your team. There's a part of the video I didn't show where they have a whole different group of people from the school who talk about each student and they see how can we support the student. So it's really important to get extra help, to work in a collaborative way with other people in your school, right? We do this in every in every work setting, we work collaboratively in teams. And this is really important when we're trying to support student success. Last week, 2 weeks ago, at my last talk, I talked about accommodations and modifications. So just for those who weren't there, to kind of remind us about that, we can change the way that the students access the curriculum. So we can work with them in small groups. We can make recordings, voice recordings for them. That's what we call accommodating their needs. And we can also modify what we expect from them. So when we talk about modifications, this means changing what we expect them to do as part of the curriculum. And sometimes that's necessary. If the students' needs are different, we might need to modify our expectations of what they should be completing throughout the day. And that really goes along with celebrating the small successes. Not all of these students will be able to do the same things as other students, and that's okay, right? As long as they can meet some goals, we can set some smaller goals for them and really just recognize their progress, even if they don't progress in the same way that other students do. I'm going to talk more about some of these, but I'll keep going for now. So again, a lot of the ones listed here are really about accommodations. So when we think about a student with selective mutism, often they're not able to talk in school. So what can we do? We can do a lot of things non-verbally. We can give them yes or no question cards that they can hold up, or they can shake their head, yes or no. There are a lot of ways that they can still communicate with us if they're understanding, if they need something, they can answer questions, they can write answers down, right? Not everything has to be done verbally. So there's a lot of ways that we can accommodate the students' needs. I think one thing that really helps as well, I talked about this last time, so this is good, I think, for a lot of different students, is having a classroom buddy, as we call it. So pairing them with a peer, another student of their same age, who can really support them and help them build a relationship, help them access the curriculum. I'm going to keep going here because I know this is a long list. So just to kind of summarize, with students, especially who've experienced trauma or who've had a difficult home environment, it's really important that we remain calm, that we keep our temper, because they're trying to push us, right? A lot of students with behavioral difficulties also to try to recognize where they're at. So we always say, we have kind of a motto that says, meet the student where they are. I'll drop it in the chat. And that just means recognize that your student might be really stressed out, and we need to pay attention to that. It's important for us to know where the student is. I think another important thing is for students to practice these skills all the time. So reminding them, this is not something just for school. This is for after school. This is for when you go to soccer practice. This is for when you're at home with your brother and sister. These are skills, because they're social emotional skills, these are skills that are really useful in all aspects of life. And I think I already talked about the other two, so I'll keep going. Do we have any questions? No? Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my experiences, so showing some examples, and then we'll kind of open it up for questions and answers at the end. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want to come off mute. Okay, so one of the students that I worked with, and just to be clear, the names have all been changed to respect the confidentiality of the students. So one of the students who I'm going to refer to as Janelle, a 13-year-old female, she presented in the school with selective mutism. So again, what do I mean by that? She was able to talk, I could say normally, when she was at home with her sister and her mother, but she did not talk at all at school. So she would not talk to professors. She would not talk to other students. The only time she would talk was if she was one-on-one with another adult and there were no other kids in the room. So this was really a social anxiety for her, where she would not be comfortable talking in front of other kids her age. So what are some of the things that worked for her? As I mentioned, setting small goals is really important. So we worked together, I worked with this student a lot, on what are some small things that you can try to accomplish. I know that talking in front of the whole class, raising your hand and answering a question in front of the whole class is not realistic, right? That's not something that she would be able to do. But okay, maybe we can talk to one teacher with one other person in the room, or maybe we can talk to one other student with no one else in the room, right? So it's okay to start small and to celebrate those small goals that she could meet along the way. And she was able to slowly start to meet some of those goals to break down that difficulty with talking in school. And as I already mentioned, another thing that really worked for her was using nonverbal communication. So she didn't always have to answer a question by opening her mouth. She could answer a question by raising her hand, by giving a thumbs up, right? By writing something down on a piece of paper. There are a lot of ways that we can communicate, and sometimes communicating verbally is not the best way or the only way that students can participate in learning, right? Okay, Jefferson. This was a 9-year-old boy. He was found eligible for emotional impairment. So to describe a little bit about what this looked like for him, this was the student who was constantly running around the school building. He was unable to stay in the classroom. He was unable to remain in his seat. He also had a diagnosis of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, right? So this also played into it as well. He was a student who didn't like to follow directions. He didn't like to hear the word no, right? So what are some things that worked for him? This student, Jefferson, had a trauma history. He had experienced abuse in his household when he was quite young, right? So he came from a very chaotic, a very unstructured home environment, excuse me. So he really needed structure in school. He needed to know that adults were paying attention to him. He needed to know that there were rules and consequences, right? And he needed to have that consistent daily structure every day, because he didn't have that at home. When you come from a home environment where there's no rules, no one's really paying attention to you, right? It's kind of scary for children, because they need structure to be able to test limits, to be able to grow. So that was something that we could provide in the school setting. And something that might include would be, for example, setting behavioral goals and providing rewards or feedback when he's doing a good job. So for example, we had a chart with little smiley faces, and every class period that he went to, we would rate him on his behavior and we would give him a smiley face, right? So if he did really well that hour, he would get a happy face. If he did okay, would get the little sideways face, right? And then if he had a kind of a bad day, he would get the frowny face. So at the end of the day, if he had a majority of smiley faces, he could have extra time in gym class, which was his favorite class. He really liked gym. So just these little types of things that provide structure, that remind students what the rules are, what the expectations are, and also provide what we call positive reinforcement, right? When they do something well, we're reinforcing that they did a good job, and that makes them want to do it more, right? By giving them rewards or just praise, like verbal praise, all these different kinds of things that reinforce positively the behaviors. Is that making sense so far? Okay, another thing that we had used for Jefferson was, which I had on one of my slides, was having a safe place or a safe person for him to go to. So that meant he had about 4 or 5 designated people, adults in the building, that he could go to their classroom anytime he wanted to. And these were people that he knew, he felt comfortable with, right? So that's why we called him a safe person. If he needed a break from the classroom, instead of running around the school building, it was, okay, go to one of your safe people and take a little break. And that's okay, right? You're allowed to do that. So sometimes students need to have someone that they trust that's a safe person that they can go to throughout the day. Okay. Caesar, this was a 8-year-old boy with oppositional defiant disorder. And this was one of my favorite students. Similarly to what I mentioned before, he was one of those students who didn't like to be told what to do, also had a lot of trouble completing his schoolwork. And I think what was most important for Caesar, which I mentioned in the previous slides, was having relationships with staff. He wasn't very trusting. He also had experienced trauma as a young kid, right? So he really needed to be able to trust people, and he needed to have strong relationships with adults around him. So I was able to build a relationship with him, and that made him a lot more responsive. And some of the things that we did together included, which we kind of saw in the video, learning self-regulation skills. I'll put that in the chat. So what do I mean by that? We as adults do this all the time and we don't think about it, but not every young person knows how to do this. So when you're upset, when you're frustrated, when you're angry, what calms you down, right? What helps you to relax? That's what we can teach kids in this situation. So we saw in the video, doing a meditation, laying down on the floor, closing your eyes, taking deep breaths. Some kids just need to go outside and run around for a little bit and get all the anger out of them. Some kids need a stuffed animal to squeeze. That helps them to feel better when they're sad or they miss their mom or dad, right? So practicing these self-regulation skills so that they know how to use them. And when the time comes that they have an angry outburst, they're already prepared to be able to use those skills. So we saw a little bit of that in the video, and that was very similar to what I did. Just to add on to that, a lot of what they're using now in schools in the US is mindfulness. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that term, but essentially that refers to being present in the moment. So trying to focus on skills that help us to be present in the moment and to recognize how we're feeling. So I mentioned a few, but this is usually things like meditation, yoga, deep breathing. Those are really popular things to teach nowadays in schools as well. Okay, and I'll go to the last one. Hopefully I'm not overwhelming you with too much information right now. So Johan, a 14-year-old male. This was a student who I initially suspected of having depression. He was very closed off. He was very reserved. He didn't talk to me much. He presented with a flat affect, as I mentioned. He didn't smile a lot, didn't laugh a lot. So I did some, questions to see if he had any symptoms of depression. And it turned out that he actually was very high for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I believe this was because of an event that he experienced when he was younger, where his father went to jail, right? And some people might hear that and say, oh, a parent going to jail, that doesn't seem like something that would be that traumatic. But it really depends on the person, right? One traumatic event can be a normal event for a person, or it can be a very traumatic event for someone. In this case, this student was very close with his father, right? He probably looked up to his father as a role model, as a sort of hero figure. So when this person, his father, was removed from his life, it was something that was very traumatic for him. So in this case, I'm gonna go to one of the examples that I mentioned. unfortunately, I was not able to help the student. And as I said before, sometimes there are some students that we can't always help on our own, right? In this case, I sought extra support. I talked to his mother about what I thought was going on. I referred him to another school counselor, to another therapist, right? There are some students that unfortunately we cannot help on our own, and we need that extra support team. I know in Brazil, you guys use SUS a lot. Most of the services that you provide for mental health are through SUS. In the US, we have staff within the schools that we can collaborate with. So whatever that looks like, whether it's outside of the school through a program like SUS or inside the school, sometimes we need to get extra help for students. There are some students that we cannot support enough in the school on our own. So I just wanted to bring up that example as well. And that is all I have for this morning. I have a few resources here. There's a lot of good stuff out there that talks about how to work with students in school settings. I have personally used everyday speech before. This is a social emotional curriculum that's online. That's really great. And Teachers Pay Teachers, I'm not sure if you guys have access to this in Brazil, but it's a free website where other teachers post activities that they've used in the classroom, and you can download these activities either for free or at a very cheap price, and you can also use those same activities at schools. And here are a few references. So thank you all for listening. And I will go ahead. We have about 10, 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, I guess. I'll go ahead and see if anyone has any comments or questions they want to share.